This isn't Dracula's tomb. He never existed. And even if he had, he wouldn't be seen dead in a Christian cemetery, or within a mile of St. Mary's Norman door. That was built to keep far more dangerous characters out, as well as letting the faithful in. When St. Mary's was built, about 1110 AD, Whitby was a North Sea frontier town. A similar door at Stillingfleet near York tells the story of Whitby as well, of St. Mary's Sanctuary, which became just that in attack. It hints at why Norman windows were built high and narrow, hard to attack and break in. St. Mary's roof is like a castle, giving defenders a high point from which to shoot arrows down. In these stones are real voices, real history, where the sea fret concealed attacking ships as they crept in. For 880 years, St. Mary has stood guard above the packed streets and the alleys below, caring, comforting in tragedy, rejoicing at homecomings, weddings, births, and at the last, burying each passing generation. Nobody is sure who first settled by the Esk, with its fish, good drainage, and clear water springs. The Romans came, perhaps exploring first as our Christian Gospels were being recorded. They left around 400 AD. Those who did not were caught in the coastal signal stations. One of these stations was on the horizon north from St. Mary's. Another may have been very close to us here. In 657, St. Hilda set up her monastery for men and women on this abbey plain, where gales strike hardest in winter, and a life of disciplined prayer began long before dawn. Her early wattle and mud church may lie beneath St. Mary's Sanctuary. 8 years afterwards, Roman and Celtic churches, the king, bishops, monks, all met for the Synod of Whitby. It was taken as read that this was the place, and Hilda the woman to manage such an encounter. No wonder all called her Mother. Differences settled here affected all Europe. For 200 dimly seen years, scholarship, training priests and bishops, service to Whitby's community flourished. Caedmon, our first English poet, and an outsider of the monastery, found God's creation not just in liturgy, but in gulls and all nature around him. Raiding Danes burnt the monastery in the 9th century. Memory of this sacred place was kept alive for another 200 years, until the Norman conquest brought Benedictine monks to rebuild our second abbey, which grew into the third above it. With a tower once above its high roof, this cliff-top abbey was one of the mightiest panoramas in all Europe. Conquering Normans ravaged the resisting north, then had to rebuild. Trade and prosperity were better than perpetual rebellion. Whitby's original streets show the layout of a Norman new town, as straight as the river allowed. Flowergate at your feet from the cliff top, or Church Street, Baxter Gate, share the common design of a set frontage to the street, a side alley to what were once back gardens, and shutters that let down to display goods for sale. Norman Gisborough, Scarborough, Pickering still lie at marketable distance each from the other, about 20 miles. Whitby, flourishing and growing under the abbey, was different. It depended on the sea. Whitby needed its own church for a growing population outside the monastery walls, so around 1110 AD, a long, narrow, high-roofed Norman church was built. The old roof line's clear on the tower, and the sanctuary has changed little since. St Mary's Tower may have been taller. Winds blow hard on the cliff top. That tower was added around 1170, the year Archbishop Thomas à Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. St Mary's Church is older than the abbey ruins and still changing to meet present needs. About 1225, the north transept was begun to change the building to traditional cross shape. The east wall is hidden behind later work, and galleries and texts, which did more for literacy than morals. A mere 170 years later, about 1380, this south transept was begun. It takes time to plan things in Whitby. In 1539, Henry VIII seized all monasteries. It took Whitby 100 years to recover, as its great abbey crumbled or was looted for building materials. St Mary's survived as town church. Former Norman windows were changed in the style of later centuries. In Elizabethan times, an oak communion table replaced the stone high altar, while around 1612, under King James I, the Cholmondeley family were lords of the manor, when they built this family pew where a rood screen had been. It was a conscious, if unwise, act, turning their backs on old forms of worship centered on priests and altar, and out to the new authorized Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and preaching at the church's center. Social distinctions remained. Those divinely appointed, in their own estimation, sat high above others. In 1697, the first gallery was erected in the south transept. Later gentrified out of recognition, it covers our theatre now. The chandelier was bought by public subscription in 1769, and the clock on the Cholmondeley pew ticked through an eternity of sermons, where churchwardens' staves prodded snorers. Above Whitby's chimneys, a world horizon opened as her people climbed to worship, for baptism, or were carried for burial, and to marry. Who was W who loved R, and carved their initials on a pew in 1699? And who carved all the 19th century pictures of ships which opened up trade beyond Whitby's horizon? Whitby fishing began centuries ago. The technology involved now makes a startling contrast to even 50 years back. And still, every year, the boats are blessed by the Bishop of Whitby. Around 1605, alum working began and brought Whitby's recovery. Alum was vital when dyeing wool, at that time our national trade. The Cholmondeleys invested at Saltick, a mile south of here, where the last remains of an alum house and of the harbour can still be seen. Special tough ships and even tougher seamen were needed to cope with such conditions, Shipbuilding flourished along the Esk and Whitby grew. More people came to pack the parish church. Villagers walked miles, or were conscripted on Sundays, and had their own designated pews under the eyes of the lord of the manor. Great shipbuilding families like the Fishburns, who built Cook ships, sat in this gallery. There is seating for up to 2,000, in theory, and so much has to do with Whitby's lifeblood, shipbuilding and the sea. By 1800, Whitby had become the 7th port in Great Britain. Her parish church had an influence far beyond the town. Her ships sailed to the Baltic in Napoleonic times for vital supplies: canvas, oils, straight timber, hemp for Whitby's 3 roperies, all supporting shipbuilding here. They also carried Durham coals to London, so helping to create the London fog so loved by filmmakers. James Cook, apprenticed as a young merchant seaman in Whitby, learnt navigation by candlelight on winter nights, with practical work refitting his master's ships in harbour by day. He worshipped here on Sundays. Years later, in great danger off Australia, his thoughts and silent prayers must have arrowed round the world to a safe harbour and the dockyard he so desperately needed, under the cliff where St. Mary's stands guard still. Whaling from Whitby began in the 1770s. The Scoresbys, father and son, killed enough whales to enrage any green movement now, and to help build Whitby's prosperous Georgian properties. They also invented the crow's nest, sailed further north than any before them, and made scientific instruments and observations in high latitudes, which gained them both membership of the Royal Society. Perhaps the preaching from this crow's nest did have its effect. The younger Scoresby later became a priest, gained a doctorate of divinity, and was rector of Bradford, fighting there for social justice. In order to observe the effect of iron hulls on a ship's compass, he later sailed to Australia in the Royal Charter, which was subsequently wrecked. The Scoresby chair, made from timber salvaged from that wreck, now stands in the Isle of St. Mary's. At the end of the 18th century, men crowded into Whitby to build ships as fast as they could be launched. Some were chartered for military transport. Others, 1787-8, took the first convicts to Australia, only 17 years after Cook named and charted Botany Bay. The brutal and illegal press gang seized men to serve in warships. Whitby crowds rioted and burnt down the gang's headquarters in 1793. In 1818 to 1820, St. Mary's was enlarged again, using shipwright designs and, after the Napoleonic Wars, spare shipyard labour. The north transept was carried right to the west wall. Skylights in the roof led to the upper deck, or to heaven itself, and mast-like pillars supported the new extension, with its deckhead beams and knees, as in a large ship. With this extension, the church formed a great preaching theatre. Boxes were sold to families to pay for the major work done. And the vestry is still the captain's cabin, but the coal fire is gone. Around 1778, the pulpit rose on tall stanchions above the aisle. It was brought down to earth again in 1847. Steam came early to Whitby. Now we're back to clockwork and tin plate. George Stephenson's railway brought the Westcliff development by the railway king, George Hudson. But he went bankrupt, leaving areas like Royal Crescent only half built. Whaling died in the 1830s, as did the alum industry soon after. But with steam, Whitby's life as a holiday town began, and with it, her overexpansion in church building to serve the new West Cliff population. Now the motorcar's taken over, convenient for visitors, but not without problems for the town. In 2 world wars, Whitby suffered heavily. Fishing was very restricted, and our struggle to survive at sea and feed the nation was desperate at times. But a bonanza of fish bred undisturbed, while the fishermen were away, and with peace and war's inventions, they were swept up in a few fat years. But then science and overinvestment became the enemy, reducing fish stocks to danger point. Labour-intensive work became automated. Even oil rigs, where Whitby men were much sought after, are reducing labour with new equipment. Behind a holiday image, Whitby was always like this, with high social problems and unemployment. The cycle of new growth, decline, poverty, resurrection has gone on down the centuries here. And over all of this, St. Mary's has watched, and still prays, listens, cares, worships. Under God alone can it survive. No human organization could, where man's vanity is so evident. A guidebook says, this church has to be seen to be believed. Perhaps that should read, this church has to be believed to be seen. So please respect its fabric, which is unique and elderly. Give to help us preserve it for generations to come. Give as generously as those who lived before us, making St. Mary's what it is. Many thousands watch in silence. In the natural progression of life, we too will join them, real people that lived in Whitby once, worshipping here, singing, bringing this church to life. They also watched summer dawns and winter gales blowing, and they came up here and went back down to Whitby by the same 199 steps we still use today.